The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily.
Hello everybody and welcome to Women's Spaces. My name is Elaine Holtz and I'm your host. And as always, I am so excited about today's show because I have two special guests with me. The first guest is a woman by the name of Neel, who just happened to be my advisor when I was at Sonoma State in 1973 to 1975 in the Women's Studies Department. And along with her is a woman by the name of Pam Smith. And together they have written a piece called Our Entangled Lives. And what's so exciting about this particular interview was I actually had the privilege of seeing both of these women perform this beautiful, beautiful piece. And what it's called Entangled Lives, a dialogue between descendants of master and slave. And it just was a fascinating, fascinating presentation. And it also let us see on so many levels how horrible it was during that time in our history. To think that we had slavery, that we actually enslaved people. I mean, it's just amazing to me. And here we are in 2011, and today we are celebrating a very tragic event in our history as women, and that was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that happened in 1911 in New York. And what that fire was all about was, at that time in our history, we were trying to form unions. You know, my father was a union man. He belonged to Mailers Union number 9. And what he's always entailed and always tried to impress upon me was if we did not have the union, we would not have an 8-hour day, we would not have vacations, and we would not have collective bargaining, which they're trying to take away from us. And, you know, when you start thinking about it, why do they want to take away collective bargaining? You know why? Because they don't want workers to have any rights. And I'm going to flash a picture here. And this is the Triangle Fire. And what happened, like I said, it happened March in 1911, actually March 25th, which is today's day. And there were women working in this factory, and what happened was it set on fire, and 142 women were either injured or killed. I think actually 99 women were actually died, and they had to jump out of windows, if you can imagine, to get out of the fire. I mean, they were completely trapped. And what happened is the door was locked because the bosses used to lock the doors before the women left because they wanted to check their purses to make sure that they didn't take any threads or any material. So what ended up happening is this horrible fire breaks out and this horrible tragedy happens. Well, what was really interesting about the fire is that in New York, the garment industry, 85% end up unionizing. And the majority of people that were working in these factories were Jewish women. And 85% of them actually organized, became union shops, so they had better wages. They actually were able to work 54 hours a week instead of maybe 90 hours a week. I mean, when you think about it, we work 40 hours a week. These women were contracted to work 54 hours, and that was good. That was positive. And at the same time, this was the only shop that there was no union. But they did comply with some issues, but not the safety issues. So what ended up happening was, here we go, the fire breaks out and all these women are injured or killed. And you know why I bring that out? Why I bring that out is because we're going to have an interesting conversation on a dialogue between descendants of master and slave. And you know, slavery was free labor. And the way I look at it now, when I look at our labor laws and some of the things they're trying to do, I have to question, you know, what are they looking to have free labor or all of us to work maybe below minimum wage? I mean, think about it. Without collective bargaining, what do we have? We don't have too much. So there's a lot to think about, and I hope we're all thinking out there, because in these days we need to think and we need to protect ourselves a little bit more. And as the story unfolds between Anne and Pam, you're going to see what happened with people when they didn't have any rights, and what happens generations later when the descendants of these people begin to come forward and start dialoguing with each other. It's a very, very interesting process. Anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce my two guests, Pam and Neel. Welcome to Women's Spaces.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, it was really thrilling seeing your performance. I mean, I don't know what other way to call it, but it was a beautiful performance, and it was very, very well written. I mean, I have to say, it was well written, and it was really articulate the way you presented it, and I was just honored to be there. So the way I like to start the show off is if you just tell me a little bit about yourself. I mean, I can introduce you and let my viewers know just a little bit. For example, Neel, like I said, Ann, wave your hand. Hi, Ann.
I'm here.
Ann is a professor emeritus of comparative sociology and women's studies, and that's where her and I first met. And Pam Smith is a project management and communications consultant in Chicago. You're all the way here from Chicago,
I
Pam?
am.
Well, welcome to
Thank
California. And she works for many, many, many nonprofit organizations. So the way I like to start the show off is I've said a few things about you. Now, anything you feel comfortable talking about, please. Why don't you start, Ann?
Boy. Well, let's see. I'm an old Sonoma County person, actually. I was here in the late 60s and taught at the junior college in Sonoma State for a few years before I went up to the University of Puget Sound, the place that you mentioned. All that time I've been really interested in race relations as well as gender relations and women's studies. And it's the kind of thing that turns me on. I mean, it's what I want to know about. It's what I want to research. And it actually is because I was researching my family, and it wasn't just my family, it was my whole background in Missouri. And I found out it was a slaveholding county, that I ended up doing a lot of work on those records, and as a result, Pam Smith called me up one day from Chicago.
So you actually started doing the research, and then you and Pam came together.
Absolutely. I've been doing it for about 10 years before I met her.
How interesting. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, Pam.
Well, let's see. I guess I come to this. My father was an activist, and so I grew up kind of with this orientation of, there were injustices in the world that needed to be addressed, and that people had to actually do something. And my father had a lot of perseverance. I have his old letters where he wrote to presidents and Congress people, and he was relentless on, issues ranging from Martin Luther King's birthday becoming a national holiday to all sorts of discriminatory sorts of issues. So that was kind of my frame growing up. And I started wanting to go to Africa when I was very young, and my mother says she doesn't really know where I got that from. When I was 13, I started talking about wanting to do that. And I did that when I was in my mid-30s, and that really helped to shape my kind of worldview too. And kind of in between those two things, I developed this interest, probably out of both of those perspectives, is to want to know about my family and where they came from. And so I did some research, talked to my grandmother, called back to Missouri, and they referred me in that first telephone call to Neel, to Professor Neel, because her family had lived in the same area, and she was a professor at the University of Puget Sound, and maybe she could help me because I was asking for other sources that I could look at for slavery.
So how did she help you? I mean, what after you had this first conversation, what were some of the ideas or some of the direction that she helped you in?
Well, I called her up, and first of all, I was surprised that she took my call. I just thought busy professor. I wasn't sure if she would take the call. And so I was surprised that we had a lot in common and kind of were very chatty from the very beginning. Because when you're doing genealogy, especially when you're looking at a town, a very small rural town, you're kind of excited that somebody else is interested in that same rural
right.
town, and we're talking about mid-Missouri. So, she talked to me about different sorts of records that were available, like census records and slave schedules and that sort of thing, and so that kind of pointed me in the direction.
So what is it like for you when Pam first called you? I mean,
I was really excited, but I want to say, in addition to what she's saying, is that Pam had been looking at a lot of records already. Pam is a really good researcher, and here's what, her calling me was just another way of doing research. You call anybody who has anything to do with that topic and see what background or new ideas you can get. What she was doing is looking for her ancestor, Baltimore Robinson. Sometimes it's Robinson, sometimes it's Robertson. And she had just called the, do you mind if I see?
No, go ahead.
She just called the Randolph County Historical Society, which she does all the time. She'll just call somebody, and whoever it is, it's like, some famous person or whatever, because she gets good information. And she'd call them, and they said there was a black marriage record, and here is Baltimore Robinson's marriage in 1865 to Emily Morris, and blah, blah, blah. And that's when she said, is there anything else? And see, I'd already gone to that county probably 3 or 4 times, and I'd copied all those marriage records. I was looking at, when Pam called me, I already was looking at slaveholding families in Randolph County, Missouri.
So let me just ask you this. It's just a curious question, because I was really curious when I was listening to you both at Sonoma State when I saw the presentation. What was the feeling, you being a Caucasian woman and Pam being an African American woman? What was the feeling as both of you come together and you're looking at this very deep topic and something in our history that I don't think many of us are very proud of. What was that? What was that thought or that feeling?
You're saying initially before we found out any connection between ourselves,
right?
It actually didn't have any. I wasn't thinking, is it a black person or a white person who can help me? I was thinking, who can help me find my enslaved ancestors? Because I also had begun to learn that in order to find my ancestors who were enslaved, I first had to identify the people who owned them. So I've always said that my interest in the white families, I was interested in them only in so much as they could help me find my people. My interest then and now continues to be, trying to find and recognize and honor, the people that came before me.
So it sounds like you both had a goal, and the goal is kind of what made it solid.
Well, there's more to it than that.
Okay.
I mean, when Pam called me, I get phone calls from people. I teach different kinds of people all the time. I get to know different people with different interests. And I was delighted when I heard this phone call from this woman in Chicago that wanted to know about Randolph County, Missouri. And as I've often said, a lot of people, when I was doing that work, were very interested in that I was looking at slaveholding families and all that. But who knows about Randolph County, Missouri? I mean, nobody. And so here she was, and she was all hot to go on it, and I was excited, and we have a similar high energy level and sense of humor. And we very quickly, she can get anyone to tell them their life story in 2 minutes. That's what she's good at. But so she has a lot of friends, an easy way with people, and so we both just clicked and we had great times. As genealogists and family history people do connect with each other a lot.
That's true.
It's a very neat community,
yes.
I mean, in that way. And they help each other, and they don't immediately, ooh, slavery, or something like that. They know.
Or even, ooh, that person's black or that person's white,
Well, let me ask you another question.
Okay.
Why was it so important? I mean, what was the importance of finding out about your ancestors, finding out about your ancestors, going to Africa? Why was that important to you?
I think for a lot of African Americans in this country, going back, we know our immediate families, but beyond that, it's kind of like you're a person without a homeland, which was, part of what was really exciting to me about going back to Africa. So it's finding the people who, when people were held as slaves and were listed just as property and not by their name, finding out who those people really were, making that connection to my own life, and being able to go back over the generations. I think I teach a summer genealogy class for high school students, and I've found that even students who don't have a particular interest in history, and they'll tell me that, when they start interviewing their grandmother or talking, it roots them in a way that's difficult to get in any other way, because it helps them know where they came from, who they are, and it gave me that same kind of feeling.
It's interesting when you say that. I can only relate on a very personal level. My people came over from Poland and Russia, and when they got to, Ellis Island, they misspelled their names. You didn't know really where they came from. And then, you had the other stigma of nobody wanted to talk. That was the old country. Nobody wanted to talk about it.
Right.
So it's really exciting that, that you were able to find some of these things and be able to find out who your family was. So let's start, explain genealogy just a little bit to our viewers. What is genealogy? I mean, what are some of the steps that you had to take?
Either one, okay. Well, the first step of genealogy is that you start with yourself and you work your way back. So, you want to look at your own life. Who are your parents? What's your life story? What's the life story of your parents, your grandparents, and begin to work your way back. And then to document that on a pedigree chart where you can, start to see it. And then, you look at official records that are available, like birth certificates and death certificates, and marriage records like Anne did, and newspaper articles, any sources that you can begin to find. Two of my favorites are a death certificate and also a probate record, and maybe would like to talk more about the probate records. But the death certificate has a lot of information that provides us with new information as a family historian or as a genealogist. And these records can often take us back a generation, because when a person died, the person who gave the information, who is called the informant, that person had to also list the person who died, their parents. So it says the mother of so-and-so, the father of so-and-so. So this is very exciting new information, that we haven't had. It also lists the cemetery, the date that the person died, their age, the cause of death, all of those things. So I find records very exciting.
Well, it sounds like, I never heard of that before. In fact, my husband and I were talking about that. We never thought of the death record of having so much information on it, as the birth. When we were even looking at some of the death certificate that we have in our own birth certificate, and there's a lot more information, like you said. So what are some of the things you found? I mean, in relation to each other. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. That not only were you just calling up to find out what she was doing in this particular county, but from what I understood, it sounded like there was some sort of relationship between the two of you.
Well, we didn't start there. I just want to say in general that people might be interested in the fact that if you like detective stories, or if you like gambling at all, that's what genealogy is like. I mean, you work and you work and you work, and then you hit and you get all this stuff. And it's very exciting because it's useful stuff. It's information, oh my God, I found the death record of so-and-so, and that meant that he lived in Hawaii and did this and did this. And it's a very enjoyable
and addictive.
That's what I tell my students. This is addictive because you get into it and you keep going and you keep going. And it's endless because, of course, you can find out all about your grandparents, but what about their grandparents? And what about their grandparents' grandparents? And then pretty soon you're looking at a whole framework of people. And it's exciting because you begin to see how it's all related to history starts to make sense. And in this country, we are so ahistorical. People are so uninterested in what's gone before, don't even have any concept of how much history is affecting them all the time. If you don't mind, I'd like to read a little quote about this big.
Go right ahead.
It's by James Baldwin, and he says...
Just explain a little bit who James Baldwin was.
Okay. James Baldwin was a major African-American writer of the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. He wrote many novels. He's an incredible essayist and critic. Beautiful essayist. And this was a book, an article called White Man's Guilt, in a book by David Roediger called Black on White. And he says, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We're unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, because attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more human and more liberating, one begins to attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history. Well, it's by learning these things and knowing these things that you begin to take away its unconscious nature and see it and acknowledge it and get out of denial. And that's one of the things that I started doing. I was originally looking at pioneer families in this county, because I was in that county in Missouri, because I was teaching the social history of American women, and I make my students do these projects. I make all of them every time, whether it's a race class, a women's studies class, or whatever. And I decided on a sabbatical I should do my own. And so I went to this county where my grandparents came from, and I found out that my people had been there for 5 generations, which was utterly astonishing to me, because we moved every year of my life. So that's what I'd done prior to meeting Pam. And I also was looking at the whole county, because I'm not trained as a historian, I'm trained as a sociologist. And at that time, you know, I'd say to people, I can't do my own family. I mean, come on, that's not fair. I mean, you don't get to do your own family. Well, now people, it's more legitimate to do your own family if you're a sociologist or a historian. And so I was busy trying to understand what slaveholding was in the county, how it changed over the decades, and that sort of stuff. And that's why I was copying the slaveholders' records, the what else did I copy? I don't remember. I copied a lot of records because there weren't letters and diaries. A lot of those people didn't read and write, and I mean the owners. I was quite shocked to find out that some of my ancestors didn't read and write, you know. And anyway.
Well, I think that's very interesting, you know, and I just want to go back to something that Baldwin said that kind of struck me, is what do you think he meant by the tyrannical? He mentioned that word tyrannical past. I mean, what do you think that?
Question.
What do you think that means?
Well, it's about the power the past has over us, because we imbibe and by osmosis take in the culture and the attitudes and the beliefs, and it's not just our parents. It's like in popular music, it's in media, it's in the films we see, the things we read. We soak up a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't know about you, but I grew up learning eeny, meeny, miny, mo the wrong way. And do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, what was interesting that you say that is because when we were driving home after the presentation, I started thinking of all the different things, because being Jewish, I always felt, why are Jewish people so racist? You know, why are they so prejudiced? I mean, I came from a very prejudiced family. It was shocking when I started thinking about some of the things they said to me. And what you absorb, you know, and you don't realize what you absorb, or you don't realize what you pass on from what, you know, that past generation has given you. So you end up finding out that they were in fact slaveholders. Now, had you met Pam when you found this out, or was so this was prior? So now the two of you meet, and what takes place? I mean, it must have been a real pleasure for you, because she had all these records and all this information.
It was. She had a lot of information on her family. I still had to do the research. You know, I was in the process of doing the research on my family. And so I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned before, trying to identify the people who might have owned my great-great-grandfather Baltimore, because since he was considered property and not a person, he was not listed by name. So it's not like I could go back in the census records like other groups and look for a name. You know, if you're looking for an enslaved person, they're just listed, let's say it's a 14-year-old male black person who was enslaved. On the census records, on an addendum to the census record called the slave schedule, it will say 14MB, so for a 14-year-old male black. So it was doing that kind of research that I eventually came upon a Philip Robertson that I thought might have been the slaveholder.
The tricky part is you had to look at the post-slavery records because it's the first time the census ever gives names of black people. I can't emphasize that more. They're not named as people, but listed as property. That's what Pam's saying. And so she has to go backwards and look at the 1900 and then figure, well, he must have been
17 years old in 1850.
In 1850. So she looks at the 1850 and looks for a 17-year-old black male whose name might be Robinson, because he might have taken the name of the slave owner. He might not have.
Right.
But he did.
Well, let me ask you a question. Now, something curious is that when they own these people, I mean, you think about it. I mean, you know, people don't realize. Right. I mean, it's really a sad. You know, I mean, when you talk about your history, I remember I was watching Fiddler on the Roof, and I saw when the Cossacks came in and they made the people leave the villages, and all of a sudden there was so much powerlessness. And then when I'm thinking about what your presentation, what was it like to all of a sudden be taken from your country and thrown into a place where you didn't even know the language, and then not to have a name? I mean, how did they have names on the planet?
They were referred to. Yes, they didn't have a last name necessarily that was documented at the time, but you know, everybody had a name. Like my great grandfather was Baltimore.
Well, but on the records, they just listed you as 14 male black.
It's the property they're listing. The census is listing, for tax purposes, the holdings of the slaveholder.
Ah, okay.
And like how many cattle, how many sheep, and how many slaves. And the other piece is, you probably do understand this, because if you go back and look at the 1830 census, go any time before 1850, women and children are not listed by name either. It's only white male heads of households.
Oh, wow.
And it's just little ticks, you know, a 10 to 20-year-old, a 40 to 40-year-old. So you've got to do a lot of detective work to find out who these people are and who they are. I spent several years working with women in Randolph County who were genealogists before I met Pam, trying to find the white women's names. There were no names. You have to go to the marriage record and find out who that little tick was.
Well, do you think, it's real interesting, because when you start thinking about it, they just read the Constitution. It's very interesting. They got in front of Congress and they're reading this Constitution. And they're making it like it's this holy document when there were so many holes in it. One of them was, of course, with the African Americans. I think, what were they considered? Native Americans were not even considered a person. African Americans, I think, were, what were they?
3/5.
3/5. And then you're saying women on the census weren't even listed by name, but it looked like they were considered white property, women, white women. Oh my God, I mean, it just goes on.
You begin to learn about the structure of power in the country by looking at this stuff. I want to add one little fact that you made me think of. See, when they established this nation, they built slavery into it, like by choosing to, accept that there was such a thing as slavery, and that African American people are counted as 3/5 of a person. But this is probably going to shock a lot of people. They passed a law in 1790 that it's called the Naturalization Law. It restricted citizenship to free white persons. They didn't say males or females, but they meant males. It wasn't rescinded until 1952.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. A citizen has to be white. Now, whatever white means, we can get into a whole long discussion about that, but yeah. I mean, it's very, very interesting. There are many laws passed that are incredibly racist. And the structure of slavery, Pam can tell you about that. I mean, it took them a while to build the structure of slavery, but they did, and it was pretty firm by 1650, I think, or 1680.
I'm just thinking, I'm just going back to that triangle fire and thinking, when you just for my viewers, just to push this a little, because right now we're into all this collective bargaining and trying to take this away, to recognize that slavery is free labor.
Right.
You know, it's free labor, and this is what they were fighting for. They did not want to pay a decent wage. They did not want to have decent housing for these people who were out in the fields, all kinds of weather, taking care and creating goods and profit for them.
Right.
I mean, it's an amazing, when you start looking at it, and
Yes.
people need to look at it.
That's right.
They really need to look at it, because you know, there's an old saying, there but for fortune go you or I, you know, and we have, like what you said at the beginning about the past, you know, how it influences us today, and we need to look at that. Well, Pam, talk a little bit about some of the things that now you and Ann have gotten together. What are some of the things that you discovered collectively together?
Well, I think the biggest discovery was our connection, and the way that came about when I happened upon Philip Robertson, who I thought was the slaveholder of my great-great-grandfather, Baltimore. I called back to Missouri to a genealogist, C.C. Rice, who I had come to know, to see if she could find any records to help me confirm that hunch, because in genealogy it's very important to verify everything. And so when I got to Missouri, she had found in a county history book where there was a reference to Baltimore being sold by Philip Robertson. And in that conversation with the genealogist, she looked at the brothers and sisters of Philip Robertson. And knowing Ann, because this is all small town life, so the genealogist that I was working with, Ann had worked with prior to that. And so she knew about Ann's family. So she's looking and she's sketching out these names and the people in Philip Robertson's family, and she points and says, oh, those are some of Ann's, meaning some of Ann's family members. And, you know, I was interested just because I'm interested in my friend's family. You know, I didn't really know what she was telling me at the time. And as we went on, it became clear to me, and finally I asked her, are you saying that it's Ann's family that owned my family? Because she was looking at the names of people who had owned my family, saying she saw some of Ann's names, you know, some of Ann's family's names. So when that finally sunk in, what she was saying, it just kind of flipped my world, you know, because by now Ann and I had been friends for a couple of years, and we had been, you know, bonding over the phone and doing research together and comparing notes. And then I get this, you know, kind of blow.
All on the phone.
Okay, before we go on, I need to identify us. Hello, everybody. You're watching Women's Spaces. I'm your host, Elaine Holtz, and I'm really excited. I'm interviewing two wonderful women, Neel and Pam Smith, and they are co-producers of a program called Entangled Lives, which is a dialogue between descendants of master and slave. And the point that we're at right now, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is when Pam actually discovered that Ann's family held slaves, and in fact her family was actually part of that group. So go ahead and continue, Pam.
So I was quite shocked by that discovery, to say the least. And I was staying at a hotel, and I went back to my hotel and just called Ann, and I didn't even say hello, and I said, it was your family. And so we had to begin grappling with what that meant.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, my goodness. As I mentioned last night, I had followed the slaves of my, it's tricky because you start having to specify the various people. You want me to do
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Um,
You have to specify the various people.
I had gotten interested in genealogy partly because of my grandmother's shoebox, in which there was an obituary of this woman, Courtney Robertson, okay? And I had gotten into the genealogy of who this was, and it was my grandmother's great-great step-grandmother. And so I followed the family line up for a while. When I found out she was the second wife, I dropped that. So I wasn't thinking Robertson. You'd think I would, when I hear Robertson or Robinson, I would think, oh, maybe, you know, but I didn't even think about it because my actual blood ancestor from that relationship is Melinda Graves, okay? I mean, who cares? But anyway, so when she said that, it was Philip Robertson is the brother of my step-grandmother. But meanwhile, she raised my great-great-grandfather, so it took me a while to kind of adjust to that. But when Pam told me that, I just said, what? Because I'd already traced some of the slaves of that family, gone and found a woman in Fort Wayne, Indiana that was a current day descendant. So I thought I'd really done some big deal thing. And then I thought, oh my God, it's going everywhere. You know, I'm starting to get this from everywhere. Most of all, I was afraid she wouldn't want to be friends with me anymore. And there was an element of reality there for me to be fearful of that. Because, and I also need to emphasize that we hadn't met in person yet. So it was pretty fragile in that regard.
But also, when you think about it, when you really think about it, you know, Pam is looking at her past. She has no control. There's no way of healing or doing, you know, it's just like this past.
Right.
Then all of a sudden here's somebody in front of her that was actually a descendant from slaveholders. I mean, it's like suddenly
That's
meeting
very
a
good.
Nazi. You know?
Yes.
You know, I'm sorry. You know, I don't mean, but it's like you would go immediately into that place.
Exactly.
So how did you guys handle that? I mean, I know as women, I mean, we handle some pretty amazing things, but how did you handle that?
It took us a while.
And we went back and forth. We went through a lot of different phases. Ann and I, this is the 20th. Yeah, we've known each other 20 years this year.
Oh, wow.
So this happened in 1991 or 2 or something like that, early 90s.
Yeah.
So over that time, you know, we've gone through a lot of phases and we've learned, well, what do you have to, like, first of all, are we committed to ensuring that out of this comes a friendship? Okay. And there were times when that was clear, yes, and there were times when there was uncertainty. I mean, there were times when I felt like, why am I doing this with a descendant of the family that owned even if it's a, you know, sister of a brother or whoever, you know, it's, for me, as I said and say in the presentation, that even though intellectually I know that Ann did not do it herself, you know, it brought me face to face with that. And that was a very hurtful thing. You know, I have, you know, I've thought of myself as a keeper of the pain, that some people can look at history and not really have a feeling, you know, about it. But I feel it, you know, I feel it in my bones, you know, and it's hard for me to let it go, you know, so it's not something that I can just kind of rationalize away. I mean, I think there were phases where I tried, you know, to do that and keep kind of working and functioning, but it would come out in poetry. You know, it would come out, you know, when I couldn't speak to her in any other way, then I would write a poem and it would have some of this, you know, these kind of deep, hostile feelings, you know, that I had.
Well, do you feel that in a way it helped maybe you and your family have not only a voice of your pain, but also an opportunity maybe to look at it and see that, okay, here's a human being, it's from the past, but at the same time, not to deny what you're feeling? I mean, I think that's
very interesting, yeah. Yeah, I think it did. You know, in one poem that I wrote, I talk about, it's kind of in the ancestors' voice about, you know, my ancestors beckon from the past, untangle, advance. You know, how goes the soul in its dignified plan? You know, like there's this dignified plan of advance, reconcile, you know, become harmonious, get past the past. So I think, yes, I think my ancestors would probably be pleased, you know, to know that we, you know, have come this far.
Well, you've been able to dig something up, because I'm thinking of our culture today, how we're going now the buzzword is the Muslim people, you know, and we're all really integrated.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we're all part of the human race, and all these issues are coming up constantly, and if we don't look at them and we don't face them, how are we ever going to cure that part of ourselves? And racism, you know, people need to realize racism is very subtle. You know, you can think you're the most liberal person in the world, and all of a sudden you see somebody, and all of a sudden, boom, you're separate. You know, and you don't even realize that that's because of your own individual background, your history, and your own racism that lives within all of us. And why not put it to the test? And that's how I see what happened between the two of you. You came together. You're looking at your family, but you also put a very important concept to the test. How can I be friends? How can I forgive this? You know, how can I say I'm sorry when I really wasn't there? I mean, there's just all these different things. So to me, it's really fascinating. Go ahead.
You just brought up something really cogent, really important. How can I say I'm sorry when I wasn't there? When we were interviewed on Coast to Coast, that's one of the things they asked me is, well, have you apologized to Pam? And on camera, I said, you know, I mean, I didn't, I said, well, no, because I didn't actually do it, but I said, I do take responsibility for what my ancestors did. And I often talk about the sins of the fathers, etc., in my own writing. But the thing that happened is, then there was two funny things that happened. Number one, number one was there was a guy that Pam knew who had decided to, I'm sorry, I'm being distracted a little bit here. This guy that Pam knew who said, he saw us on television, and he said, she's just another white liberal, and she's just bullshitting, you know, that sort of thing. And Pam, amazingly enough, she argued with him for a couple hours, I think it was, or half an hour, or whatever. I mean, she stuck up for me that no, she's genuine. Then,
and the reason I could say that was because, you know, she teaches that, I mean, this is what she does for a living. I mean, she not only has looked at her own family to see what slaveholding was there, but then she teaches slavery and class and gender and, you know, all these other subjects. So she has a consciousness about these issues that a lot of people don't have.
Yeah, and then there was another, there was a white woman who was a friend of my friend who got really mad at me for saying I apologize. I mean, that I take responsibility. So I got, it's interesting because I have felt sometimes that, especially when audiences start saying to me, well, something like, well, when you owned Pam's family, I have to sit there and for a moment let them say that, and I want to say, I didn't own Pam's family.
You know, but Anne, you know, you bring up something very important that people need to be aware of, and I think that's the fear. The fear is if we look at our past, that somehow we're going to have to take responsibility. Right. And on the other hand, in a way, we are responsible.
That's right.
You know,
what are we going to do?
So at least to reconcile, to be able to reconcile, you have to come to certain conclusions. Yeah. And that's, to me, that's one conclusion. You know, it reminds me, there's a thing called Forgiving Dr. Mengele, which is a story of this woman, Eva Gore, who went back to Germany to forgive. And the fear was if you forgive, it's going to be forgotten. Well, I really believe when you start forgiving, it becomes more enlightened. It really starts surfacing, you know. But, you know, time goes by really fast when we're in this studio. We're having a really good time. And what I'd like you to do before we conclude is talk a little bit about your touring on campuses and some of the presentations. I know you've blessed me with this interview. I know you've been on Oprah and a few other shows, so I'm so grateful to have you in this studio. What are some of the things, I know you were at Sonoma State, what are some of the other ideas that you have around this particular presentation?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, we just had a conversation yesterday, I think it was, or the day before. We were driving up the road, and we were talking about, it was yesterday. we try to cram so much into this small amount of time, and we inevitably go over. Like, you know, there's so much that we each have to say, and we've each found out about, and we want to share with other people, and we want them to pay it, you know, begin to question their own lives. We really, really are committed to that. And so we start talking about, well, not only do we want to try and be better at trying to get more places we can speak, because we are not very good at promoting ourselves. We sort of halfway do it. We're really not the best. Not only doing that more intensively, but we started talking about maybe we should set it up like workshops, like for a 3-day thing. We're somewhere and we work with people for about an hour and a half, and then they go away, and then they come back and we do another whole thing, because we really do have a lot to say to help people. And I don't mean that.
And it's not just about us having a lot to say. It's given our experience, we can provide a framework for people to discuss and kind of look at some of these issues so that they can start to look at their own feelings about it, and so act as facilitators.
Yeah,
well,
exactly that.
Also to look at our history as to how all of us on some levels are connected, and how racism and prejudice really is infiltrated in our culture. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's always women who are going to stand up and all of a sudden take the bull by the horns and move with it. So I just think it's very, very exciting. Well, listen, we're coming to the end of the show, and what I like to do is I like to give my guests, and this has just been fascinating. I know we can go on, and I'm going to be running this as a special, so it'll be on a little bit longer and on special times other than just our regular time. So when people are watching, they realize if this is a little bit over 27 minutes, it's because we are going a little bit longer this time. Anyway, what I'd like you to do is, either one of you, just look at that camera, and anything that you would like to conclude or say to our viewers, anything that's in your heart, please be my guest.
Okay, I'll begin. I think that it's important to look at what has happened. I think it's important to look at our current day circumstances, disparities in education, healthcare, housing. All of these things is not just something that happened today. It has a historical reference. I mean, it comes from a certain place. And so I'd like for people to keep that in mind and just kind of consider that thought. And the second is, I'm a proponent of reparations. I think we can talk about, you know, the type, and is it a check to people, is it education? That I'm less concerned with, and more concerned with people having a personal discovery of their own by looking at their own family history of the suffering and the pain that so many people had to go through in this country. And it was a huge injustice that has not been fully recognized, and that I believe our nation is not going to heal on a racial level. I don't think we should arm twist. I'm not interested in kind of talking you into being a supporter of reparations. I think what's being done on the legal side is important, but I think I'm interested in encouraging people to look back at their own family's history so you can come to your own conclusions about what might be a fair remedy. And I'd like to thank Irene for this opportunity. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I couldn't have said it any better. And I want to say ditto to what you said. I mean, there has to be, there has to be some way of acknowledging it in a way that really satisfies people. Did you want to say anything, Anne? Anything in particular?
Well, yeah, of course I do. One of the things I wanted to stress is it's not just slavery. It's the whole thing about Jim Crow and the ways in which people of color, not just black people, though they have been the ones who've been the main target, but every other group, like you mentioned, the emphasis on Arab people today. It's like there are structures, there are ways that groups create ways to humiliate other groups, and systematically do it, and do it over a period of time. This was the whole Jim Crow system was built up right after slavery to re-establish the dominance of whites. I think what we all need is to look at what kinds of things in the outside world, in the social world, affect how we think and treat each other. And ultimately, it's a really sort of spiritual quest. It really is. We cannot continue to make all these separations and these distinctions without suffering the consequences. And we can only make it better if we do take that attempt to try kind of find some kind of harmony. And it means going through the hard stuff. It doesn't mean denial. It means facing what happened and looking at it honestly and saying what we feel and saying what we're scared of and, being honest.
Dialoguing.
Well, yeah, sure.
Well, thank you so much, both Ann and Pam. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for coming on to Women's Spaces.
Thank you for having me.
And to my viewers, whoa, this was some program. I want you to know that I learned a lot. And as you know, as I do the program and as I'm interviewing people, I'm thinking all the time. And I was thinking about this. You know, I wrote this poem called I Am Woman, I Am All Women. And I think we have to look at that. You know, why be a black woman or a Muslim woman or a Jewish woman or a white woman or whatever kind of label you want to put on us? We are women. And as women, if we can just gather and acknowledge each other and acknowledge that we are the bearers of the future, whether you have children or not, it does not matter. If there's such a thing as a great spirit or a goddess or even a god, I mean, whatever you want to call it, we've been charged to bring forward the future. And we want a good future. And that future has to be free of this prejudice, free of this racism that lives within all of us. And I think it's very important not to be afraid to look at it. Because once we start looking at it, I mean, I thought it was very interesting when I asked Pam and I asked Ann how they felt when all of a sudden, you know, here Pam discovers that Ann, actually her family actually owned slaves, what that reaction inside of her was. But at the same time, they got a chance to heal. And at the same time as Ann had a chance to say, look, I'm sorry. I know I wasn't there, but I'm really sorry this happened. It's like an acknowledgement. It's an acknowledgement. And those acknowledgments really mean a lot. And we have to think about that. And I want you to think about one more thing, like I do at the end of every program, is to try to remind my women viewers particularly to get off your duff and do something for peace. At the very least you can do is write your congressmen, write your senators, write your local people, write the President of the United States himself, and just make one simple suggestion before you write that important bill. Imagine this, before you write that important bill, before you take that important vote, you ask one question: is it good for the children? If it's not good for the children, let's not do it. Why? Because if it's not good for the children, it's not good for the future. And you know, war is not good for the future. Not having health care is not good for the future. Destroying, can you imagine destroying our education? What do we want to do? Go back to the day when people couldn't read and write? You know, I mean, come on, guys. You know, women need to stand up. They need to say, no, this is not acceptable. If you can spend billions to drop bombs, you can spend billions to educate our children and develop their brains. Anyway, it's a lot to think about. And I'll tell you, I'm so jacked up from this program. I wish I could stop thinking, but hey, that's pretty hard to do. I'm still here. I'm still alive. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. This is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces saying so long until the next time.
The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easy.